Born in 1932, Dorothy Ashby is the pioneer of jazz music that you need to know about. Initially starting on piano, she soon transitioned to playing full-time jazz harp. As a black woman in a male-dominated industry, especially on an unconventional instrument, she had to struggle her entire musical career to gain success and recognition. But her music is an endless fount of creativity and variety, and I want to convey that to you today by talking about her 1970 album, The Rubaiyat of Dorothy Ashby. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is a collection of poems translated by Edward Fitzgerald, who purports that they were originally written by 11th century Persian astronomer Omar Khayyam. I say purport because there's no evidence Khayyam actually wrote the works. Fitzgerald could have gotten the poetry from anywhere. As translator David Bellos explains in his book Is That a Fish in Your Ear? The Amazing Adventure of Translation, many authors of the past would pretend that their own original works were in fact translations of other writers to give the work a sense of mystery and exoticism. So, did Edward Fitzgerald truly translate the works of the Persian astro-poet? Did he just take the works of some random guy in Tehran? Or was Fitzgerald an aspiring poet trying to cash in on the Oriental craze by pretending that his own work was a translation? Unfortunately, we're never really gonna know. But regardless, Fitzgerald took this poetry and retranslated it several times into several different editions. And one of these editions made it to Dorothy Ashby. This has been somewhat instrumental in shaping the West's burgeoning understanding of Persian culture. So this is a copy that I have of both the first and third translations, and going by just the general wording of everything, it seems pretty clear that Ashby has based her own lyrics off of either the third translation or the fourth translation. There's a lot of quatrains in the third translation that aren't in the first, but that do make it into her own lyrics. And it's important to note that Ashby is not merely taking quatrains. She's not just going, oh, quatrain number 42, that's the song. She's actually mixing and matching things from all across the poetry. And so she might go, oh, we'll do 74, and then the rest of the lyrics of the song will be 60. And this means that she's not just doing disconnected lines, but rather she's shaping stories. She's being transformative of the poetry. She's not just reciting it, but rather taking the ideas of it and forming it into her own narratives. So the songs are much more cohesive rather than just being disconnected quotes. When you listen to the album for the first time, you'll probably wonder to yourself, why is so much of this about wine? Funnily, Ashby's treatment of the poetry is less boozy than the original text. Persian wine, or may, was a staple of their classic poetry. Even though Islam technically outlawed the drinking of alcohol, Muslims would unofficially consume large amounts of wine. As Rudy Mathie writes in Alcohol in the Islamic Middle East, Ambivalence and Ambiguity, the drinking of wine became a metaphor for the ardent feelings of the lover, for the beloved in the imaginary world of poetry. Wine was used as a romanticized concept of freedom and bohemian love, rather than literal binge drinking. All of the songs on The Rubaiyat of Dorothy Ashby follow the same basic structure. The piece opens with a musical treatment of some of Khayyam's poetry. There is an instrumental interlude, and then the song ends with a refrain of some, but not all of the lyrics. Length varies between songs. Wax and Wane is 1 line long. Shadow Shapes and Myself When Young are 8 lines. Additionally, sometimes the refrain is omitted, such as in Wax and Wane, but beyond that the songs have a pretty similar structure. My focus for the album is not the jazz instrumental sections, really. For the most part, they're very good, stylistically jazz with some influences from the Middle East, Africa, and gamelan traditions. Do some songs feel a little more like an exotic mishmash rather than Persian music? Perhaps. The use of the African kalimba confuses the area a little bit, but I don't think it degrades the quality of the actual music. Ashby often switches from European harp to the Japanese koto, which helps a lot in getting a more Asian and Eastern sound. What I'm more interested in, and why I think this album is so special and memorable, is Ashby's vocal treatment of the poetry. Dorothy Ashby actually has an incredible singing voice, and the different and experimental ways she approaches Khayyam's verse make the album varied and dynamic, while also remaining very 1970s. I think the best way to do this is to explain song by song. First, we'll group together the songs that are just straightforwardly sung. Myself When Young, Drink, Dust, and Shadow Shapes are all done with a fairly classical voice style. There's a consistent vibrato, fairly slow melodies that are mostly stepwise, avoiding large intervals except between phrases. Part of the reason these are more straightforward in the vocal department is that these songs have some of the longest and most complex lyrics of the album, so a simpler delivery gives spotlight to the meaning of the verse. Production-wise, the vocals on all four have a fair amount of reverb applied to add to the cinematic feel to the songs. So an interesting thing to note here, and perhaps my only criticism really of the music of the album, is that for many songs, the instrumental section is somewhat divorced from the rest of the song, or from the vocal sections. So in Myself When Young, you have the sung portion, then a very different instrumental section. The sung portion just kind of stops, and then the instrumental section begins, and then the instrumental section just stops, and the sung part is refrained. Meanwhile, in something like Shadow Shapes, there's a lot more of integration between the sung portion, which then carries over into a tempo change. There's an overlap between the voice and the tempo changing instrumental. And then with the new faster tempo, this carries on into the refrain of the lyrics, which are then sung over this new instrumental. So as a whole, Shadow Shapes feels very cohesive, whereas some of the songs don't feel like that. They feel like voice, instrumental, voice again. For Some We Love presents its lyrics rather differently. Ashby delivers the two lines in two different ways, spoken word and sung. But rather than doing these deliveries at different times, both readings play simultaneously. The sung vocal is heavily reverbed, high-passed, and plays at a lower volume to set it in the background. Meanwhile, the spoken vocal has no reverb, and you can hear the lower frequencies of Ashby's voice, making it the version of the lyrics that listeners are more likely to latch onto. This is furthered by the sung vocal having a very vertical melody with large intervallic jumps, sometimes even octaves. The sung vocal is also accompanied by a koto playing the same melody, and is done with very free-form rhythms. Let's give an example. This makes the sung vocals very hard to understand. This makes the sung vocals very hard to understand the words. They are less there as lyrics and more presented as an instrument themselves. The spoken version allows for the listener to still understand the words. Notice how the sung vocal always starts a new phrase. And then the spoken word plays catch up afterwards. Almost as if it were a live translation by an interpreter. Wax and Wane has the shortest appearance of lyrics on the album, at only 2 lines. But even then, the treatment is interesting, with a telephone-like EQ effect on the sung vocals and a warbling melody, immediately followed by a discordant harmony in the violins. Something strange about the moon searching for us? Wine the Infidel presents the first major deviation from the vocal style of the album. Rather than being sung, the words are aggressively whispered at the listener, complete with a harsh telephone EQ and a mild reverb. By the way, telephone EQ is a term that refers to a mixing effect where you remove most of the low frequencies and highest frequencies of a track, leaving a heavy emphasis on the 1000 to 4000 Hz range, simulating the sound of a voice spoken through an analog telephone from pre-2010 and earlier. The lyrics of Wine the Infidel are hinting at Khayyam's suspicion at wine sellers, that they're overselling their product and ripping him off. The whispered tone helps Ashby imply that she is imparting a great secret to the listener. Okay, so now we've made it to one of my favorite moments on the whole album, in the song Joyful Grass and Grape. First off, does grass refer to the Persian equivalent of the devil's lettuce? Maybe. Your guess is as good as mine. The piece opens up fairly simply, with Ashby monologuing yet more lyrics of wine with a simple reverb over an oriental-themed melody played on the koto. After the first two lines, there's a nearly 40-second interlude on just the koto before the true magic happens. Imagine Ashby's voice, spoken as if through gritted teeth, beginning in the left ear before moving right, a ping-pong delay, repeating the words in equal measure, but disorientating all the more. So what also makes the song great is that Ashby, she puts a lot of care into the intonation of the words and the stress and strain of the lyrics. She's not saying, oh, better be joyful with grass and grape. It's better be joyful with grass and grape. Almost as if she's taken a hit of the aforementioned grass. But it's that very specific intonation, it's stress, that makes the quote memorable. It feels as if she is heavily intoxicated, almost a simulacrum of intoxication. And when you combine that with the ping-ponged vocals, it makes for almost a psychedelic experience, and it elevates the lyrics above just being about drinking wine. At this point in the track listing, we've made it to Shadow Shapes, and although I went through it previously in the video, I'd like to take the time to mention it again. It really serves as the high point of Ashby's singing on the album, as well as curation of the poetry into lyrics. From the grandness of the opening lines, we are but a moving row of magic shadow shapes that come and go, that are sung over almost free-time string chords, to the burst of energy following the first vocal passage. The song has the best through line and development of energy on the album, and when the final held chord is reached, you feel the same chills as if you just finished an epic novel, the chill that something great has just been displayed to you. Heaven and Hell shares a lot with the other sung pieces. Operatic tone with heavy vibrato, this time leaning towards more of a soprano register. Note the line, "O threats of hell and hopes of paradise." Ashby sings this with an almost frail worry. "O threats of" is over a C minor 7 chord, while hell is over a D flat 7, which is from a completely different key, hammering home the awfulness of hell, whereas the C minor under "and hopes of," the word paradise sounds over a B flat major 7 chord. In the B flat major key, C is the second note in the scale, and C minor 7 is the 2 chord, part of a progression C, F7B, or 2-5-1, which is one of the most well-known chord progressions in Western music. The progression signifies finality and heroism, and Ashby putting "hopes of paradise" over a truncated version of this progression emphasizes the sanctuary of paradise, especially in contrast to the unusual chord progression for hell. The end of Heaven and Hell also features one of my favorite instances of Ashby using effects on her vocals. It's really simple, but when Ashby sings, "The flower that once is blown forever dies," you hear it nice and clear in the left ear, but then Ashby repeats the line, but this time her voice is panned to the right ear, and there's a heavy EQ effect, similar to the previous telephone sound from Wine the Infidel. It almost sounds like it's decayed. Now that the flower has blown, it is indeed dying. "The flower that once has blown forever dies. The flower that once has blown forever dies." The final song on the album is "The Moving Finger." The vocal intro to this is probably the flashiest and most well-known part of the entire album. As Ashby sings the famous quote from Khayyam about the finality of time, overdubs of her voice are added, each singing its own note. These build up to form a C minor 13 chord, every note in the C Dorian scale stacked on top of each other in thirds. This resolves to a G major 7th chord, a very unexpected minor 4 to major 1 cadence. Da, da. But that carries a huge sense of gravitas, as collectively the voice parts move down in pitch, as if the listener has sunk into the depths of eternity. The instrumental to this song has very little to do with this opening and is perhaps the weakest of the album, but I keep finding myself returning just for the intro of the song. The song and the album ends with Ashby reciting, "The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on," with a repeated delay on her voice, almost reminiscent of Jamaican dub songs. The message is clear. You have finished the album, and now it is time to move on. Ashby has made the album, and now she will move on. Dorothy Ashby put 100% into everything she did musically. Every time she did a new album, she changed her style, and she embraced it 100%. No irony, no sarcasm, no mockery. I hope that by analyzing this album, I've shown you just even a little bit of the genius that she was. And I hope that it really inspires you guys to go and listen to much more of her music. If you're looking for a good place to start, I would recommend Dorothy's Harp. Well, that's the end of the video. For all of you who have made it this far, I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, comment, subscribe, and consider supporting me as an artist by buying my album. Bandcamp link in the description.